Welcome back to the Bedtime lore. Tonight, we journey to a time when the whole of human knowledge could be held within the walls of a single building, when everything that had ever been thought or observed or dreamed into words was gathered together on scrolls and tablets and sheets of pressed papyrus, stacked gently in rooms that smelled of cedar oil and old ink. We are going to visit the lost libraries of the ancient world, those great quiet temples of memory that once stood in Alexandria and Nineveh, and in half-forgotten cities across the Mediterranean and beyond. These were places where scribes spent their entire lives copying texts by lamplight, where scholars argued softly in courtyards shaded by fig trees, and where the accumulated wisdom of civilization was kept safe against the slow erosion of time. So let your eyes close now, let your breathing deepen, and allow yourself to drift back across the centuries, to a world lit by oil lamps and warmed by the patient labor of those who believed that a single written word could outlast an empire. Let the quiet hum of the present fall away, and let this story carry you gently through the ancient halls of learning, where every shelf holds a whisper from the past, and every page is a bridge across the silence of centuries. Let us begin in the city of Alexandria, on the northern coast of Egypt, where the Mediterranean Sea meets the wide green delta of the Nile. If you had arrived here by ship sometime in the 3rd century before the Common Era, you would have seen the great lighthouse of Pharos rising from its island at the mouth of the harbor, its flame visible for miles across the dark water, guiding sailors home through the night. The air would have carried the salt tang of the sea, mixed with the warm, earthy fragrance of the delta marshes beyond the city walls, and the faintest trace of incense drifting from the temples along the waterfront. The city itself was barely a century old, founded by Alexander the Great and shaped by his successors, the Ptolemaic kings, who dreamed of making it the intellectual center of the known world. And at the heart of that dream was the library, or more precisely, the Mauseon, the Temple of the Muses, a sprawling complex of colonnaded walkways, lecture halls, dining rooms, botanical gardens, and of course the great reading rooms where tens of thousands of scrolls were stored in pigeonhole shelves carved from stone and wood. The library did not spring into existence all at once. It grew slowly, scroll by scroll, through decades of careful and sometimes inventive acquisition. The early Ptolemaic kings sent agents to every major port in the Mediterranean world, with instructions to buy or borrow any book they could find, regardless of language or subject. Ships arriving in Alexandria's harbor were searched by officials, and any scrolls found on board were taken to the library to be copied by teams of scribes, the originals sometimes kept, and the copies returned to their owners, a practice that must have caused no small amount of quiet frustration among traveling scholars who arrived at their destinations to find their personal libraries had been temporarily requisitioned in the name of knowledge. But the result was extraordinary. By the middle of the 3rd century, the library may have held somewhere between 200,000 and nearly 500,000 scrolls, an almost inconceivable number for the ancient world, representing the literary, scientific, and philosophical output of Greek, Egyptian, Persian, Hebrew, Babylonian, and Indian civilizations all gathered together in a single, sunlit complex on the shores of the Mediterranean. Imagine the daily rhythm of the library in those early, flourishing centuries. The morning light filters through high clerestory windows into long halls where the air is cool, and still, and carries the faint scent of papyrus and the mineral tang of freshly ground ink. Scribes sit at low wooden desks, their reed pens moving steadily across fresh sheets of papyrus, copying texts that have arrived from distant cities in battered leather cases and sealed clay jars. Each scribe works slowly, carefully, forming each letter with the kind of patient attention that we might recognize today in a calligrapher or a watchmaker, pausing now and then to dip the pen, to check a difficult word against the original, or simply to stretch the fingers and listen to the birdsong drifting in from the garden courtyard. Nearby, a scholar reads aloud from a scroll of Aristotle's Natural Histories, his voice a low murmur that blends with the soft scratch of pens and the occasional rustle of papyrus being unrolled from its wooden rod. In the gardens outside, where plane trees cast dappled shade across paths of packed earth and gravel, a group of astronomers discuss the movements of the planets, their conversation unhurried and speculative, drifting between observation and theory the way a boat drifts with the current. The library was not merely a storehouse of books. It was a living community of thinkers, a place where scholars were given free lodging and meals and access to the entire collection, so that they could devote themselves entirely to study, research, and writing. The Ptolemaic kings understood that knowledge thrives in community, that ideas grow richer and more nuanced when shared between minds, and so they created a space that was part university, part research institute, and part retreat, a place where the life of the mind was honored above all other pursuits. The great mathematician Euclid may have worked here, composing his Elements, that foundational text of geometry that would be studied and copied and argued over for more than 2,000 years. The poet Callimachus created the Pinax, a vast catalog of the library's holdings organized by subject and author, which was itself a work of enormous scholarship, running to 120 volumes and serving as the ancient world's closest equivalent to a search engine. Eratosthenes, who served as the library's chief librarian, calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy, using nothing more than the angle of shadows cast at noon in two different cities, a feat of quiet brilliance achieved not through grand expedition or expensive equipment, but through careful observation, a willingness to correspond with a colleague in a distant town, and the slow, patient work of mathematical reasoning. There is something deeply soothing about imagining these scholars at their work, unhurried, absorbed, surrounded by the accumulated thought of centuries, their minds free to wander through the vast landscape of human inquiry without the pressure of deadlines or the demands of commerce. The library offered them a kind of sanctuary, a place set apart from the noise and bustle of the city outside, where the only urgency was the urgency of understanding. And the city of Alexandria itself was a gentle host to this enterprise, its broad avenues lined with limestone buildings that glowed pale gold in the afternoon sun, its harbor busy with merchant ships carrying grain and glass and linen, and always more scrolls from distant lands arriving in leather satchels and sealed clay jars, each one a small gift from the wider world. The papyrus that filled the library's shelves came from the marshes of the Nile Delta, where the tall green stems of the papyrus plant grew thick along the riverbanks, swaying gently in the warm breeze that moved across the water. Harvesting papyrus was careful, rhythmic work. Workers waded into the shallow water in the early morning, when the air was still cool, and the marshes were alive with the sound of herons and ibis, and cut the thick stalks near the base with curved blades. The outer green rind was peeled away to reveal the pale, fibrous pith inside, which was then sliced into thin strips with a steady hand. These strips were laid side by side on a flat stone, slightly overlapping, and a second layer was placed on top at right angles, creating a kind of natural weave. The two layers were then pressed together, either under a heavy stone or with a wooden mallet, and left to dry in the sun, the natural sap of the plant acting as a gentle adhesive that bound the fibers into a smooth, flexible sheet. When dry, the sheets were polished with a rounded stone or a piece of ivory, until the surface was smooth enough to receive ink without bleeding or blurring. The result was a material that was light, portable, and surprisingly durable, capable of preserving words for centuries if kept away from moisture and the patient appetites of insects and mice. The ink used by the scribes was equally simple and elegant in its composition. It was made from carbon, usually from the soot collected above oil lamps or from charred wood, mixed with gum arabic, a pale golden resin harvested from acacia trees that grew in the dry land south of the delta, and a little water. The mixture was shaped into small cakes or sticks and allowed to dry until it was hard and compact, easy to store and transport. When a scribe was ready to write, he would grind a small amount of the dried ink on a stone pallet, adding water drop by drop until the ink reached precisely the right consistency, thick enough to hold its shape on the papyrus, but fluid enough to flow smoothly from the tip of the reed pen. The pens themselves were cut from the hollow stems of marsh reeds, sharpened to a fine point, and split at the tip to create a small channel that held the ink by capillary action, much like a modern fountain pen. There is a quiet pleasure in thinking about this simple technology, this elegant chain of plant and soot and water and resin that allowed human thought to be fixed in visible form and carried across the world, from hand to hand, from century to century, from one curious mind to another. Now let us leave Alexandria for a time and travel much further back in history, and much further east, to the ancient city of Nineveh, which stood on the eastern bank of the Tigris River in what is now northern Iraq. Here, more than 6 centuries before the great library of Alexandria was even imagined, another kind of library was being assembled, one that used not papyrus and ink, but clay and the sharp wedge of a reed stylus pressed into soft earth. This was the library of Ashurbanipal, the last great king of the Assyrian Empire, who ruled in the 7th century before the Common Era, and who possessed an almost insatiable hunger for the written word. The city of Nineveh in Ashurbanipal's day was immense, surrounded by massive walls of mud brick that stretched for miles along the riverbank, enclosing palaces and temples and gardens, and the bustling quarters of merchants and craftspeople. The Tigris flowed wide and brown past the city walls, carrying the rich silt that had nourished this land for thousands of years, and that gave the scribes their most essential material. The tablets in Ashurbanipal's library were made from this same alluvial clay, the soft, fine-grained mud that lined the banks of the Tigris and the Euphrates. A scribe would take a lump of this clay, knead it until it was smooth and free of air bubbles and pebbles, and shape it into a flat rectangle roughly the size of a human hand, sometimes a little larger for texts that required more space. While the clay was still soft and damp, the scribe would press a wedge-shaped reed stylus into its surface, creating the tiny angular marks that we call cuneiform, one of the earliest writing systems ever devised, a script that had been in use for more than 2,000 years by the time Ashurbanipal's scribes sat down to work. Each tablet was then allowed to dry in the sun or, for more important documents, baked slowly in a kiln until it was hard and dense and cool to the touch, capable of lasting for thousands of years. Ashurbanipal's scribes copied texts from every corner of his empire and beyond, drawing on collections in Babylon, Borsippa, Nippur, and Ashur. They gathered hymns and prayers addressed to the gods of Mesopotamia, medical treatises describing remedies for everything from headaches to snakebite, astronomical observations recording the movements of the stars and planets across the night sky, mathematical tables for calculating areas and volumes, legal codes governing trade and marriage, and literary works of remarkable depth and beauty, including the great epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest known work of narrative literature, a story of friendship and loss, and the search for meaning that had been told and retold in Mesopotamia for more than 1,000 years before Ashurbanipal's scribes carefully set it down on clay. The library may have contained as many as 30,000 tablets, each one carefully cataloged and stored in designated rooms within the royal palace, arranged on wooden shelves with small clay labels identifying the contents of each section, not unlike the card catalogs and subject headings that would be used in libraries thousands of years later. Imagine the quiet industry of the scribal workshops attached to the palace at Nineveh. The rooms are cool and dim, their thick mud brick walls keeping out the fierce dry heat of the Mesopotamian summer. The scribes sit cross-legged on reed mats spread across earthen floors, their damp tablets balanced on their knees or on low wooden stands, their styluses moving with practiced precision across the soft clay. The only sounds are the soft press of reed into earth, the occasional murmur of one scribe reading, aloud to another to check a difficult passage, and the distant call of birds from the palace gardens, where pomegranate trees and grapevines grow in neat rows along channels of clear water. The air smells of wet earth and the faint sweetness of date palms ripening in the afternoon sun. A young apprentice carries a tray of freshly prepared tablets from the mixing room, each one wrapped in a damp cloth to keep it workable for as long as possible. An older scribe inspects a finished tablet, running his fingertips lightly over the impressions to check their clarity and depth, before setting it aside on a reed mat to dry slowly in the warm air. This is the slow, patient, rhythmic work of preservation, the quiet daily effort to hold the memory of an entire civilization in the palm of a hand. What makes Ashurbanipal's library so remarkable is not only its size, but the extraordinary breadth of its ambition. The king himself, unusually for an Assyrian ruler, was literate and deeply proud of it. He boasted in one inscription that he could read tablets written in Sumerian and Akkadian, languages that were already ancient in his day, that he could solve complex mathematical problems, and that he took personal pleasure in the study of old and obscure texts. His library was not a mere symbol of royal power or a trophy of conquest, but a genuine and deeply personal act of intellectual curiosity, an attempt to gather and preserve the entire accumulated knowledge of Mesopotamian civilization, stretching back more than 2,000 years to the earliest days of writing itself, when the first accountants in the temple complexes of Uruk pressed their reeds into wet clay to record the quantities of grain and livestock passing through their storerooms. Among the treasures of Ashurbanipal's collection were tablets devoted to the study of the natural world, lists of plants and animals and stones compiled by scholars who walked the fields and riverbanks of Mesopotamia with the same careful attention that a modern botanist might bring to a forest survey. There were tablets describing the behavior of different species of birds, the medicinal properties of herbs that grew along the irrigation canals, and the qualities of various types of clay and stone used in building and sculpture. There were astronomical diaries, records kept night after night by observers stationed on the rooftops of temples, tracking the movements of the moon and the 5 visible planets across the sky, noting eclipses and conjunctions and the first appearances of stars on the horizon, building a body of data that stretched back centuries, and that would eventually form the foundation of what we now call astronomy. These records were not dramatic or exciting in themselves. They were the product of routine, of patience, of showing up night after night to watch the sky and write down what was seen. And yet from that routine emerged an understanding of celestial cycles so precise that Mesopotamian astronomers could predict eclipses years in advance, a remarkable achievement born not from genius, but from the simple, quiet accumulation of observations over generations. The concept of a library, of a deliberate gathering of written knowledge, was not unique to Alexandria or Nineveh. Wherever writing took root in the ancient world, people found ways to collect and organize their texts, driven by the same quiet impulse to hold onto what they knew. In the cities of ancient Sumer, temple archives held thousands of clay tablets recording everything from grain inventories to hymns to the goddess Inanna, their contents spanning the mundane and the sacred with equal care. In the Hittite capital of Hattusa, in what is now central Turkey, archaeologists have uncovered a royal archive of more than 30,000 tablets, many of them dealing with treaties, religious rituals, and diplomatic correspondence with neighboring kingdoms. The pharaohs of Egypt maintained their own archives in temple complexes along the Nile, where priestly scribes recorded astronomical observations, medical remedies, and the elaborate rituals of the afterlife on rolls of papyrus stored in sealed clay jars and placed in niches carved into the temple walls. Each of these collections had its own character, its own rhythm of daily use, its own particular atmosphere. In a Sumerian temple archive, a scribe might spend his morning recording the quantities of barley and wool and sesame oil received as offerings, his small round-tipped stylus pressing neat columns of numbers into the damp clay, while in the afternoon he might turn to the more meditative work of copying out a hymn that had been sung in the temple for generations, the same ancient words repeated and preserved across centuries like a melody that never quite fades from memory. In an Egyptian temple library known as the House of Life, priestly scholars studied the movements of the stars and the cycles of the Nile's annual flooding, correlating their observations with records kept by their predecessors over hundreds of years, building a slow, cumulative, deeply patient picture of the natural world that required no sudden revelation, only continuity and care, and the willingness to add one more line of data to a record that had been growing for longer than anyone could remember. There is a pattern here that is worth pausing to notice, not for its drama, but for its quiet and persistent beauty. Across the ancient world, in cultures separated by thousands of miles and centuries of time, people arrived independently at the same fundamental insight: that knowledge is fragile, that memory fades, and that the spoken word, however powerful, vanishes the moment it is uttered, scattered by the wind like smoke from a cooking fire. And so they invented ways to make thought visible and durable, pressing marks into clay, painting ink onto papyrus, carving letters into stone, scratching symbols onto strips of bamboo. And then they gathered these records together into collections, into libraries, creating reservoirs of accumulated understanding that could survive the death of any single individual, any single generation, any single city. The library, in its deepest essence, is an act of profound and gentle optimism, a declaration that what we know and what we feel is worth saving, that someone in the future will want to read what we have written, that the chain of human curiosity stretches forward without end into a time we cannot see. The scribes who maintained these collections were, in many ways, the unsung guardians of civilization. They were rarely wealthy, rarely powerful, rarely celebrated in the songs and stories of their own cultures. They lived modest, disciplined lives, rising early with the light, working long hours in quiet rooms that smelled of damp clay or dried papyrus, eating simple meals of bread and beer and dried fish or figs, and returning to their desks in the afternoon to continue the work that filled their days with a kind of purposeful calm. But their labor was essential, more essential than they could have known. Without them, the thoughts of philosophers would have scattered like seeds on dry ground. The observations of astronomers would have faded with the morning light, and the stories that gave meaning and shape to entire cultures would have been lost in the space of a single generation. The scribe's work was a kind of gentle, daily resistance against the forgetting that time imposes on all things, a patient act of care that held the world's memory intact. As centuries passed, many of these great collections began to diminish, not in a single dramatic moment, but slowly, gradually, the way a coastline erodes grain by grain under the patient work of the sea, or the way a path through a meadow disappears when no one walks it anymore. The Library of Alexandria did not vanish in a single catastrophic fire, as popular legend sometimes suggests. Instead, it declined over several centuries, diminished by neglect, by shifts in political power and patronage, by the slow deterioration of papyrus in the humid Mediterranean air, and by the simple, relentless passage of time. Scrolls crumbled and were not replaced. The natural oils in the papyrus dried out over the decades, making the sheets brittle and fragile, so that a scroll that had been supple and smooth when first made might crack and flake at the touch a century later, its text breaking apart like frost on a window pane. Scholars drifted away to other cities where new patrons offered fresh support, and new libraries were being built. The buildings that housed the collection were repurposed for other uses or fell into quiet disrepair, their roofs leaking, their shelves emptying one by one, their garden courtyards growing wild with untended fig trees and climbing vines. By the time the last remnants of the library's collection disappeared, perhaps sometime in the 4th or 5th century of the Common Era, the loss was not a sudden catastrophe, but the quiet conclusion of a long, slow twilight, a candle burning down to its final flicker in a room that no one was watching. Ashurbanipal's library met a different but equally instructive fate. When Nineveh fell to a coalition of enemies in 612 before the Common Era, the great palace was brought down, and the city was gradually buried beneath rubble and sand, and the slow accumulation of wind-blown soil. The clay tablets, far more durable than papyrus, were sealed in the earth like seeds waiting for a distant and unimaginable spring. They lay there for more than 2,400 years, undisturbed, patient, silent, until British archaeologists led by Austen Henry Layard and later Hormuzd Rassam began to uncover them in the middle of the 19th century. The tablets emerged from the ground still legible, their cuneiform impressions as sharp and clear as the day they were made, a testament to the extraordinary durability of clay as a medium for preserving thought. In a sense, the very destruction of Nineveh preserved its library. The falling walls and accumulating dust and centuries of rain and wind acted as a protective blanket that kept the tablets safe through millennia of change, holding them in a kind of quiet suspension until the world was ready to read them again. The stories of these libraries remind us how fragile knowledge can be, how easily the accumulated wisdom of centuries can slip away if no one tends to it, if the funding runs out, if the building leaks, if the political winds shift and the scholars move on to other cities. But they also remind us of something more comforting, that the impulse to preserve, to gather, to remember, is as old as civilization itself and as persistent as the desire to breathe. Every library that was lost was also, at some point, built, and the act of building it was an expression of hope, a quiet wager that the future would care about what the past had learned. That hope was not misplaced. We are still reading the texts that survived, still marveling at the geometric proofs of Euclid and the poetry of Gilgamesh, still learning from the medical recipes inscribed on clay tablets in ancient Nineveh and the astronomical observations recorded on papyrus in the temples of Thebes. The libraries themselves may be gone, their columns toppled, their shelves empty, their gardens overgrown. But the knowledge they held has not entirely vanished. It has simply changed form, passed from scroll to codex to printed book to glowing screen, each transformation a new act of preservation, a new expression of the same ancient, enduring impulse to hold onto what we know and to pass it forward into hands we will never touch. In the centuries that followed the decline of the great ancient libraries, the work of preservation passed quietly into new hands. In the monasteries of medieval Europe, monks copied Latin and Greek texts by candlelight in small stone rooms called scriptoria, their quill pens moving slowly across sheets of vellum made from the carefully prepared skins of calves and sheep. The scriptoria were quiet places, often governed by rules of silence, and the only sounds were the scratch of quill on skin, the soft turning of pages, and the distant chanting of prayers from the chapel next door. Each manuscript was a labor of months or even years, the text copied letter by letter with painstaking accuracy, the margins sometimes decorated with tiny illustrations of flowers and birds and winding vines, rendered in pigments made from ground minerals and plant dyes. The whole work bound in thick leather covers with metal clasps and stored in the monastery's small but carefully tended library, where the books were sometimes chained to their shelves to prevent loss. These monastic scribes were the direct spiritual descendants of the copyists who had worked in Alexandria and Nineveh, carrying on the same quiet tradition of preservation that had sustained human knowledge for thousands of years, their patient labor bridging the gap between the ancient and the modern world. The preparation of vellum was itself a slow and meditative craft. The animal skin was first soaked in a bath of lime and water for several days, then carefully scraped with a curved blade to remove the hair and any remaining flesh, a process that required a steady hand and considerable patience. The cleaned skin was stretched on a wooden frame and left to dry in the open air, tightened periodically as it contracted, until it became a smooth, pale, translucent sheet with a surface that accepted ink beautifully. The finest vellum, known as uterine vellum, was made from the skins of unborn or very young calves and had an almost silky quality, thin enough to see light through but strong enough to last for centuries. The monks who worked with this material understood its value and treated it with great care, sometimes erasing and reusing old manuscripts when fresh vellum was scarce, a practice that inadvertently preserved traces of earlier texts beneath the new writing. Palimpsests that modern scholars have learned to read with the help of ultraviolet light and digital imaging, recovering words that were thought lost forever. In the Islamic world, the tradition of the Great Library flourished with renewed vigor and extraordinary creativity. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, founded in the 8th century of the Common Era during the golden age of the Abbasid Caliphate, became a center of translation and scholarship that rivaled anything the ancient world had produced. Scholars working in its halls translated Greek philosophical and scientific texts into Arabic, preserving works by Aristotle, Plato, Galen, Hippocrates, and Ptolemy that might otherwise have been lost entirely during the upheavals that swept through the former Roman world. They also produced original works of remarkable depth and beauty, advancing the fields of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, optics, and chemistry far beyond anything the ancients had achieved. The library's translators worked with the same patient care as their predecessors in Alexandria, sitting in quiet rooms perfumed with rosewater and sandalwood, comparing multiple copies of the same text to establish the most accurate version, annotating difficult passages with explanatory notes in neat marginal script, and debating fine points of meaning with their colleagues over cups of sweetened tea or small dishes of almonds and dried apricots. The physical books produced in the Islamic world during this period were themselves works of art, objects of beauty and devotion that reflected the deep reverence Islamic civilization accorded to knowledge and the written word. The paper, which had been introduced from China through the trading routes of Central Asia, was smooth and cream-colored, made from cotton or linen fibers beaten to a fine pulp and pressed into thin, supple sheets that were far more durable and versatile than papyrus. The calligraphy was executed with reed pens cut to produce elegant, flowing lines, the lustrous black ink contrasting beautifully with the pale surface of the paper. Important texts were sometimes written in gold or deep blue ink, and the margins were decorated with geometric patterns and arabesque designs of astonishing intricacy, each line and curve drawn with mathematical precision and an artist's instinctive sense of beauty. The books were bound in leather tooled with floral motifs and interlocking geometric forms, their covers sometimes inlaid with small pieces of gold leaf or delicate traceries of colored thread. To hold one of these books was to hold an object of great beauty and great care, a physical embodiment of the belief that knowledge deserves not only preservation but celebration. The libraries that housed these books were scattered across the Islamic world, from Cordoba in southern Spain to Samarkand in the heart of Central Asia, forming a vast network of learning that connected cultures and continents through the shared language of scholarship. The Great Library of Cordoba, built by the Umayyad caliphs in the 10th century, was said to have contained some 400,000 volumes, a number that dwarfed anything in Christian Europe at the time, and that required a staff of librarians, catalogers, and bookbinders working continuously to maintain and expand the collection. The library was open to scholars of all faiths, and its reading rooms were places of quiet conversation and shared inquiry, where Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars worked side by side, translating texts from Arabic into Latin and Hebrew, carrying knowledge across the boundaries of language and religion, with a generosity of spirit that speaks well of what human beings can accomplish when curiosity is valued above division. In the cool, pillared halls of this Andalusian library, the ancient knowledge of Greece and Rome met the original discoveries of Islamic science and philosophy, and from that meeting flowed a stream of learning that would eventually help to kindle the intellectual awakening of medieval and Renaissance Europe, carrying the thoughts of Aristotle and Euclid and Ptolemy back into a Latin-speaking world that had very nearly forgotten them. As we drift further into the quiet hours of this story, let us think for a moment about the individual texts that were lost along the way, the works that existed once in carefully copied scrolls or neatly pressed tablets, and are now known to us only by their titles or by brief quotations preserved in the writings of others. The Greek playwright Sophocles wrote more than 120 plays over the course of his long career, but only 7 survive complete. The Roman historian Livy composed a monumental history of Rome from its mythical founding to his own day in 142 volumes, of which only 35 remain. The philosopher Democritus, who proposed with extraordinary prescience that all matter was composed of tiny indivisible particles he called atoms, wrote more than 70 works on physics, mathematics, ethics, and music, and not a single one has survived intact. The poems of Sappho, who was celebrated throughout the ancient world as one of the greatest lyric poets who ever lived, have come down to us only in scattered fragments, a few complete stanzas and dozens of broken lines preserved in quotations by later admirers, or discovered on scraps of papyrus pulled from the dry sands of Egypt. We know just enough to glimpse the beauty of what has been lost, the way a single shaft of light falling through a gap in the clouds can suggest the brilliance of the sun hidden behind them. There were entire fields of knowledge that existed once and are now barely recoverable. The Romans were skilled hydraulic engineers who built aqueducts and fountains and elaborate bathhouse heating systems. But the technical manuals that described how to design and maintain these systems have almost entirely disappeared. The Carthaginians were renowned sailors and agricultural innovators, and a Roman general named Mago wrote a treatise on farming in 28 volumes that was considered so valuable it was translated into Latin and Greek, but it too has been lost, surviving only in fragments quoted by later agricultural writers. These losses are not sharp or immediate in the way that a fresh wound is sharp. They are more like the distant, gentle ache of an old memory, a soft sadness that something beautiful once existed and is now beyond our reach, like the fading echo of a song heard long ago in a room you cannot find again. And yet the losses are not absolute. Fragments remain, scattered across the centuries like wildflowers growing in the cracks of an ancient wall. Quotations preserved in the works of later authors give us glimpses of what has been lost, like light filtering through the seams of a closed door. A single sentence from a lost work of Heraclitus, quoted centuries later by a philosopher who admired him, can illuminate an entire way of thinking about the nature of change and permanence. A passage from a lost Greek medical text, preserved in an Arabic translation made in Baghdad 1,000 years later, can reveal the sophistication of ancient surgical techniques and the compassion of physicians who tended their patients with herbs and honey and the gentle pressure of practiced hands. These fragments are precious not only for what they tell us directly, but for what they suggest, the vast unseen landscape of thought and creativity that lies behind each surviving scrap, the enormous and irretrievable body of human understanding that once existed and has now passed beyond recall, like a river that has flowed into the sea and become part of something larger and unnamed. There is a particular kind of beauty in these fragments, a beauty that comes from incompleteness, from the way they invite the imagination to fill in what is missing, to wonder, and to dream about the whole that once contained them. A broken statue from ancient Greece, missing its arms and its features worn smooth by time, can be more moving in its way than a perfect copy, because the damage itself tells a story of the long journey the object has taken to reach us, of the earthquakes and the rains and the slow burial under centuries of soil, of all the hands that have touched it and all the eyes that have rested upon it across the long span of time. In the same way, a fragment of a lost text carries within it the weight of everything that has been lost and the quiet wonder of everything that has, against all odds and all probability, survived. Each fragment is a small miracle of endurance, a word or a sentence that has traveled thousands of years through fire and flood and neglect to reach us, arriving like a letter from a friend who lived so long ago that even their name has been forgotten. And the scribes and librarians of the ancient world could not have known which of their texts would survive and which would be lost. They could not have predicted that the clay tablets of Nineveh would outlast the papyrus scrolls of Alexandria, or that a single copy of a Greek play, preserved by chance in a monastic library somewhere in medieval France or southern Italy, would be the only version to reach the modern world. They worked without knowing the outcome, copying and cataloging and shelving their texts with the same patient care, whether the work was destined to endure for millennia or to crumble to dust within a century. And there is something deeply admirable and deeply restful in that, in the willingness to do the work of preservation without any guarantee that it will succeed, simply because the work itself is worth doing, because the act of caring for knowledge is its own quiet reward. Let us settle now into the quietest part of our journey, into the hours when even the scribes have set down their pens and the reading rooms stand empty and still. Imagine an evening in one of these ancient libraries, the oil lamps burning low, their small flames barely flickering in the motionless air, casting a warm amber glow across the rows of shelves and the pale surfaces of rolled papyrus. The shelves are full of scrolls and tablets, each one a small act of faith in the future, a message sent forward across time by someone who believed that their words might matter to a stranger living centuries or millennia from now. The room is warm with the residual heat of the day, and the only sound is the faint creak of wooden shelves settling in the cooling air and the distant murmur of the sea or the river beyond the city walls, the same water that has been flowing past these stones since long before the first scribe sat down to write. Outside the library walls, the city settles into its nightly rhythms. A watchman makes his rounds along the colonnaded street, his sandals soft on the paving stones, his small lantern swinging gently at his side and casting a circle of gold across the ground before him. Somewhere in the residential quarter, a mother sings a lullaby to a restless child, her voice rising and falling in the same melody that mothers have sung for thousands of years, a melody as old as language itself. The last fishing boats are pulled up on the beach below the harbor wall, their nets spread to dry in the salt air, and the lighthouse flame turns slowly on its island, sending its beam out across the dark and empty water. The world is at rest, and the library rests with it, holding its knowledge in the same still darkness that holds the sleeping city, the sleeping harbor, the sleeping sea. This is the hour when the library reveals its truest and most tender nature, not as a collection of objects, but as a gathering of voices, each scroll and tablet holding the living thoughts of someone who once breathed and wondered, and looked up at the night sky with the same quiet awe that you might feel on a clear evening. The astronomer who mapped the movements of the planets is here, and the physician who recorded her remedies for fever and headache, and the poet who described the way the evening light falls across the surface of a river, turning the water to a sheet of hammered gold. Their voices are quiet now, held in the patient stillness of ink and clay, waiting for the next reader to come and release them, to bring their words back to life in the warmth of a living mind, as a breath of air brings a sleeping coal back to its glow. The great libraries of the ancient world are gone, their buildings long since returned to dust and stone and earth, their gardens overgrown, their lamps extinguished. But the idea of the library endures, as alive and as necessary as it ever was. The simple and beautiful notion that knowledge should be gathered, preserved, and shared, that the thoughts of one generation should be available to the next, and the next, and the next, in an unbroken chain of understanding that stretches back to the very first marks pressed into wet clay on the banks of a river in Mesopotamia more than 5,000 years ago. Every library that exists today, from the grandest national collection with its millions of volumes to the smallest shelf of well-thumbed books in a village school, is a descendant of those ancient rooms in Alexandria and Nineveh, a continuation of the same quiet, essential work that began when the first scribe realized that a thought, once written down, could travel further than the voice that spoke it and last longer than the hand that held the pen. And so tonight, as you lie in the stillness and let these images drift through your mind like clouds passing slowly across a darkened sky, think of the scribes at their desks in those lamplit rooms, their hands steady, their attention focused, their pens tracing the shapes of words that would travel further and last longer than they could ever have imagined. Think of the warm glow of the oil lamp on the papyrus, the smell of cedar oil and old ink, and the faint, earthy sweetness of damp clay, the soft whisper of a finished tablet being set aside to dry in the afternoon sun. Think of all the hands that have reached for a book or a scroll or a tablet across the long and winding span of human history, drawn by the same simple and enduring desire to know, to understand, to remember, to hold onto something true. That desire is with you still, as natural and as constant as breathing, as old as the first marks pressed into river clay, and it will carry you gently now, like a slow current on a warm and quiet river, into sleep. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us here at the Bedtime Lore. Rest well tonight, and let the memory of those ancient rooms, those patient scribes, those shelves full of whispered knowledge, settle softly around you like lamplight in a darkened hall. The libraries may be gone, but their gentle warmth remains, carried forward by every story ever told and every page ever turned. Until next time, sleep deeply, dream kindly, and carry a little of this old, gentle wisdom with you into tomorrow. Good night.